Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Happy Thursday morning. Thank you for listening to The Ron Show, whether it's on the America One Radio app, AmericaOneRadio.com, wherever you podcast, on demand at ProgressiveVoices.com. So we now have a school voucher bill that is headed to Governor Brian Kemp's desk, awaiting his signature. And I got to tell you, it's pretty breathtaking to watch as Republican leadership in the state of Georgia. And let's not mince words here. The state of Georgia, most southern states, have been in control by conservatives most of their existence. Remember that. When you complain about all the ills that Georgia has to deal with, failing schools, lack of health care access, transportation woes, chief among them, remember who has been in charge for most of this state's existence. I'll touch on the school voucher thing in just a few minutes, but I'm going to give you an example of Georgia Republicans trying to address something that is a glaring need that they stubbornly refuse to admit their solution doesn't work. And that the obvious solution that would work, well, they can't wrap their minds around embracing that solution because, oh God, it might mean confessing that the other side had a better idea. Literally, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Georgians lack health care access, and some die because Georgia Republicans refuse to accept that the other side had the better idea. Maybe not the best idea, but the better idea. KFF Health News, Andy Miller and Renuka Rayasam reported on this days ago. Georgia's Medicaid work requirement, the Pathways program that Governor Brian Kemp championed, costs the state millions and has super low enrollment. Let me read to you some excerpts of this article. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp's plan for a conservative alternative to Obamacare's Medicaid expansion has cost taxpayers at least $26 million so far, with more than 90% going towards administrative and consulting costs rather than actual medical care for low-income people. Kemp's Georgia's Pathways to Coverage offers government health insurance to people earning up to the federal poverty level. That's $15,000 for a single adult, if they can document that they're working in school or performing other qualifying activities. Since July, when the program began, about 3,500 people have signed up, according to state officials. That is a fraction of the Georgians who could enroll if the state expanded Medicaid without such requirements. Republican leaders in several states have sought to require that people who are eligible for Medicaid through expansion work, arguing the health program for low-income Americans shouldn't be a handout. Kemp's experiment, aimed at single adults with low incomes who aren't already eligible for Medicaid, is the only current effort to survive legal challenges, but critics say it creates obstacles for people in need of health care while wasting taxpayer dollars on technology, consultants, and attorneys' fees. The Pathways program is, quote, fiscally foolish and anti-family. That's Joan Aiken, executive director and co-founder of Georgetown University's Center for Children and Families. She noted that full-time caregiving does not qualify someone for eligibility into the program. A lot of taxpayer money has been wasted, she said, and not on health care for people who need it. Continuing, the state projected that administrative costs will increase to $122 million over 4 years, mostly in federal spending as it rolls out key features of the program, including the collection of premiums and verifying enrollees' eligibility according to an internal planning document dated December 2022 obtained by KFF Health News. The primary consultant for the project is Deloitte, which is collecting hefty fees. Georgia's GOP-led state legislature has rejected what Democrats say would be a far simpler way to cover the state's low-income workers, expanding Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. That could make at least 359,000 uninsured people in Georgia newly eligible for Medicaid, according to KFF data. If you're doing the math, that is 100 times more than the Georgia Pathways program would. In addition, Georgia could reduce state spending by $710 million over 2 years, according to KFF research from 2021. You would think fiscal conservatives would want to save the state $710 million over 2 years. That's a lot of money. The article continues, despite Georgia's rocky implementation experience, state Republican leaders have put off considering a full Medicaid expansion. In such conservative states as Mississippi, Idaho, and South Dakota are weighing similar work requirements. You are spending money primarily here to put people through an extra set of hoops before they get coverage, said Benjamin Summers, a professor of healthcare economics at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The low enrollment for Pathways has disappointed supporters as the state projected more than 26,000 residents would enroll during its first year and 52,000 by the end of 5 years, which by my math is still only 1/7 of those who are eligible for full Medicaid expansion. Even by their own estimates, that's a failure. 1/7 of all participants who would be eligible for full Medicaid expansion? Chris Denson, Director of Policy and Research at the conservative Georgia Public Policy Foundation, which supports Pathways, said the low enrollment numbers are, quote, just part of the ramping up. Scrolling down further, about 45% of Pathways applicants were still waiting to be processed based on the state's most recent monthly reports. That's according to Leah Chan, Director of Health Justice at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, a nonprofit research organization that supports full Medicaid expansion. That eligibility system, she said, quote, the thing that we've spent the most money on is actually one of the things standing in the way of the program seeing higher enrollment. The State Department of Community Health reported $26.6 million in pathway spending through December 31st, of which more than 80% was paid for using federal funds. Deloitte was paid $2.4 million to prepare and submit the application to the federal government. Just $2 million was paid to insurers to cover medical care. In the fourth quarter, administrative costs alone rose by more than $6 million. The total costs do not include legal fees for defending the Pathways program. The state Attorney General's office said that as of February 7th, those costs surpassed $230,000. In striking contrast, North Carolina has enrolled 380,000 beneficiaries in its Medicaid expansion as of March 1st, according to the state's Department of Health and Human Services. North Carolina became the 40th state to expand Medicaid under the ACA on December 1st, a move that has prompted fresh debate over expansion in a handful of other southern holdout states, I believe Mississippi being one of them. Georgia, which has one of the highest uninsured rates among states, is currently the only state that requires people in its Medicaid expansion population to prove they are working or doing other qualifying activities to gain health coverage. A spokesperson for Kemp, Carter Chapman, told KFF Health News that the governor, quote, remains committed to implementing Georgia Pathways, an innovative program expanding coverage to tens of thousands of otherwise ineligible low-income Georgians, despite the Biden administration's continued efforts to disrupt its rollout. In February, citing the delays in implementation, Georgia filed a suit against the federal government to ensure the work requirements program could continue running through 2028 instead of 2025, when it was originally scheduled to end. And I'll talk about the particular idiocy of the work requirement in my next segment. But I first want you to listen to a conversation that Representative Dr. Michelle Au had on the Politically Georgia podcast a few weeks back when she was talking about Georgia's inability to get past this Medicare obstacle on the right and how it affects us all in our wallets, even if we don't see it.
I think that the lives of Georgians would change because we would all of us, regardless of what type of insurance we have, would have easier access to care and more affordable quality care. What we see in Georgia is that Georgia has the second highest uninsurance rate in the nation. And how that translates is that Georgia hospitals have to bear an incredible burden of uncompensated care costs, meaning that patients who don't have health insurance still need health care, right? But what happens is that because they don't have health insurance, they don't have access early on, so they delay their care. They wait until it becomes critical. And what happens is that we end up having more critical patients, more complex care, more expensive care, right? And that cost is borne by all of us, right? I think that when we look at the cost of closing the coverage gap and expanding Medicaid, we have to look also at the cost of not expansion. And that cost is what we've been bearing, what we've been seeing for the past 10 years since the ACA passed, and since we've continued to refuse to take this federal assistance that is available to us.
So because there would be billions of dollars, or at least many millions of dollars, coming to Georgia as a part of Medicaid expansion from the federal government, where is that cost borne right now? Is that uncompensated care that hospitals are taking the hit on? Is that insurance rates for other Georgians? That money is being dispersed elsewhere to other people to pay for all this.
That's absolutely right. And you were right that it is billions with a B. That cost is borne by all of us in a number of ways. When a hospital takes on a high burden of uninsured patients, and there's regional variation therein, right? We see it a lot in rural communities, in communities with lower income patients, right? That the hospital often takes on a lot of that cost, because when a patient comes in through the ER and needs care, we have to take care of them, right? Not just because of EMTALA law, which is a federal law that requires that patients cannot be discharged without stabilization and treatment, but ethically, we have to treat patients that need our help, right? So the hospital ends up bearing a lot of that cost. Individual providers end up bearing a lot of that cost because eventually we have to write it off if patients can't pay, right? Patients end up having to pay a lot out of pocket, and those costs are astronomical. Yeah. It's a top cause of bankruptcy for individual patients. And the rest of us, regardless of what type of insurance we have, end up bearing those costs, because that's why we see insurance premiums go up, is this cost is spread all around, right? So I think it's one of those things where people don't appreciate that high level of cost that we all bear, because it is invisible to some degree in a way that other costs are not, right? We don't get a receipt for it. It's not like when you go to Publix and you buy chicken, you're like, oh, it's $3.25 for this. It's a different type of cost, but we all are bearing it every day. And I think we've become maybe inured to it because it has been such a long standing cost, but we see it in the outcomes in our state, that we have very poor health outcomes. I think our access is poor, and we've had many, many rural and urban hospital closures as a result of this untenable cost burden that we bear.
What she's saying is, when you complain about the cost of your health insurance coverage, or you complain about the cost of your hospitalization or your visit to a clinic, you look at the bill and you see what your insurance covered and you see what you have to pay out of pocket. Yeah, you get mad about that, but it's a problem that we could be solving if we covered more Americans, particularly those in need. There are those on the right, and obviously the Kemp Pathways program leans on this, who say, well, yeah, but they should have to work for it. I actually believe that there are hundreds of thousands of Georgians who would like to be able to work for it, but can't. Stand by, I'll explain when the Ron Show returns. Feel free, by the way, to chime in whenever you like at 404-919-2725. My inbox, ron@ronshowatl.com. We're on everything but TikTok, I believe, at Ron Show ATL when it comes to social media. If you have something you'd like to say or want to follow, feel free to do so. I'm always struck when I see a regeneration, a regurgitation of some conservative trope that perpetuates their political mindset and just like further entrenches them into their ideological positioning, when overwhelming evidence to the contrary of said trope is abundant. Now, I realize Google is not research. It's a search engine. But Google can be your friend. If you don't like Google, go Bing, DuckDuckGo, whatever. Use whatever you need to. The information is readily available out there for you when you have questions, and when your preconceived notions are challenged. Maybe head to that search engine and say, well, wait a minute. Why do I believe this? And is this true? Is this believable? The right to work requirement comes to mind when it comes to healthcare. Now, I mean, on the surface, you would think, well, yeah, we don't want people just sitting on their butts, being lazy, getting something for free. I mean, listen, you're listening to a liberal audio show and podcast whose host is as Bernie Sanders progressive as they get. I don't believe people should just be sitting on their duff getting something for free without putting something in to get it, right? ... When possible. State proposals for Medicaid work requirements will cause many low-income adults to lose health coverage or not be able to have it in the state of Georgia, including people who are working or are unable to work due to mental illness, opioid or other substance use disorders, or serious chronic physical conditions, but who cannot overcome various bureaucratic hurdles to document that they either meet work requirements or qualify for an exemption from them. These coverage losses will not only reduce access to care and worsen health outcomes, but will likely make it more difficult for many people to find or keep a job. Thus, Medicaid work requirements may be self-defeating on their own terms. That, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Don't believe me? Think of your own situation. How many times have you awoken not feeling yourself? You may not fully have the flu or a nasty head cold, but you feel it coming on and you tell yourself, I got 10 sick days. Let me use one here. It's Monday. It's Friday. I'm just heading into a long weekend. I'll just make it a long weekend and recover. Now imagine that's how you would feel every day or worse. And you don't have health care coverage to go be seen by a primary physician, to rule out whatever it is or isn't, to be treated for it, to be prescribed a Z-Pak or whatever antibiotic you need for whatever it is that you have so that you can be treated and better in a couple of days and back at it. Now imagine that's you, but you don't have health care coverage. And you'd like to go to work, or maybe you do have a job. You just started a job and you really feel like crap. And you either can't go to work or you go to work and you just cannot function well. And your boss who just hired you looks at you and says, why are you so lethargic? Why are you so lazy? Why are you not able to do your job? And the next thing you know, you keep going to work, you're not feeling well and you're not performing well and you lose your job. And now you've lost your ability to meet those work requirements so that you can have the health care coverage that the state would offer you if you were working. Back to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Work requirements will make it harder for most adult beneficiaries, the lion's share of whom are already working or are ill, disabled, caregivers, or in school, to get and stay covered. Supporters of work requirements generally say that these policies target only people who are not working, actively seeking work, caregivers, in school, or unable to work because of an illness or disability. The guidelines, however, allow states to apply work requirements to nearly all non-elderly adult Medicaid enrollees, except pregnant women and some people with disabilities. Of the roughly 25 million people nationally who could be subject to work requirements, 60% are already working, and 79% have at least one worker in the family. Of those who aren't themselves working, more than 80% are in school or report an illness, disability, or caregiving responsibilities that keep them from working. Yet states could require most of these 25 million enrollees to meet burdensome paperwork and documentation requirements to prove that they are working or volunteering sufficient hours each month or meet the criteria for an exemption. The unfortunate reality is that for the large majority of enrollees who are already working or face serious barriers to employment, work requirements have little or no possible benefit, but they will add red tape and bureaucratic hurdles that will cause some of these people to lose coverage. Documentation and paperwork requirements have been repeatedly shown to reduce enrollment in Medicaid across the board, and people with serious mental illness or physical impairments may face particular challenges in meeting these new documentation and paperwork requirements. The easiest way to overcome this in the state of Georgia is to accept full Medicaid expansion. 3,500 have enrolled for a grand total of $26 million spent as of the end of 2023. 3,500. With a fraction of that $26 million going to actual health care coverage. I believe it was $2 million of the $26 million actually going to reimbursing for health care needs. For 3,500 Georgians, when there are 359,000 who are eligible for full Medicaid expansion. The state of North Carolina enrolled about that many just since taking on Medicaid expansion last December. That's incredible. For a little more than 3 months, the state of North Carolina has already given healthcare coverage, provided the means for healthcare coverage for more people than Georgia has that are uninsured. And they did it in a little more than 3 months. And yet here we are spinning our wheels in the state of Georgia, letting people stay chronically ill who could be going back to work, could be filling jobs, could be adding to our tax coffers. They just get it back because we're not going to fill potholes. And all because we have an obstinate governor and a party that supports him who just cannot confess that maybe, just maybe, the other side had the better, maybe not the best, but the better idea, the more fiscally responsible at that idea all along.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
Oddly enough, I started today's show thinking I was going to go in on school vouchers, which, by the way, just awaits the governor's signature. But the Medicaid thing is such a glaring example of where Georgia Republicans cannot help themselves by doing the right thing, so they're going to try something else until... I really don't know when. When will they see that red is red, orange is orange, the sky is blue, water is wet? When it comes to Medicaid expansion, no big deal. You just have 359,000 Georgians who are in chronic need, who cannot get that need met, and many will die. No big deal. The pro-life party. School vouchers, by the way, passing in the Senate. Senator Greg Dolezal pining about that. Let's let him reel off his perceived pros on this.
Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues. Good afternoon. I want to highlight for you some changes that the House made to Senate Bill 233, and then I'll remind us all of what this bill does, answer any questions, and be on my way. Senate Bill 233 passed this chamber over a year ago and has really been through 2 rounds of changes in the House. The first round of changes I'm not going to talk about because we all had the summer to review those. But the round of changes that I do want to talk to you about are the round of changes that were in the substitute that the House passed out last week. First and foremost, one of the changes that they made was to have a means-tested priority for students whose parents earned 400% or less of the federal poverty level, which is about $120,000 for a family of 4 in 2024. Next change that the House made was to establish a new dedicated authority that will be housed within Georgia Student Finance Commission to provide for a clear separation of financial resource management of a K-12 education funded program. They established next that the program will not begin until the fall of 25-26, so next year's school year, not the one coming up in this fall. They added a section that puts into law all cumulative teacher pay raises since 2019. And as you know, we've had bipartisan support for these pay raises. It incorporates House Bill 941 from Speaker Pro Tem Jones and Chairman Irwin that provides that public schools may use capital construction dollars for voluntary public pre-K programs. Next, it references the existing statutory hold harmless language as it relates to FTE and QBE calculations. Next, it references the existing statutory language that allows for parents to enroll their children in a public school that is located within a school system in which the student resides if there is space available after the assigned students have been enrolled. Next, it caps the appropriation to the equivalent of 1% of the total QBE budget. That cap would equal $140 million this year as we invest in our existing budget $14 billion in K-12 education. And then lastly, the Georgia Promise Scholarship Act will stand repealed in its entirety on June 30th, 2035, or 10 years after the bill becomes effective, with the caveat that any student who is currently enrolled in the program will be able to essentially complete their K-12 education on the pathway that they're currently on. Those are the changes made in this bill, colleagues. I do want to take a moment of personal privilege. This has been a 6-year journey for me and a lot of people around the state. And Mr. President, this would not have happened without the significant support of your office as we fought to ensure that this bill gets across the finish line. To my colleagues in the Senate majority, this would not have happened without your support. I remember my freshman year, 2019, when this bill failed on the floor of the Senate. And it means the world to me that 5 years later, we united around this tailored bill that we could all agree is a step in the right direction.
Is it?
We wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for Governor Kemp identifying this last year over the summer at the start of the session as a priority, for the first time mentioning in a State of the State address by any governor in the history of the state of Georgia, putting the families at the centerpiece of the education, decision-making for their children, and allowing choices and options in education for those students who are in a school that may not be serving them best. Would not be standing here today were it not for Speaker John Burns and his commitment to getting this across the finish line. And lastly, we would not be standing here were it not for the advocates all around the state, both those who are advocating professionally, but more importantly, those parents who are advocating for their children, many of which wake up every day today and go to a school where the majority of third graders may not be able to read on grade level, or they just may not be the best fit in that school for whatever reason.
For whatever reason.
And to my colleagues in the minority party, the last couple of times we have passed this or had this vote in the House, we've had a couple members of your party join us. And I wonder if anyone wants to do that today. The water is warm. We see states all over this union recognizing the importance of these bills. Many of these children are in your districts.
But not, we're not talking about Medicaid expansion anymore, are we? We don't want to talk about all the many states who have, See, it's funny how you want to use that caveat, but not when it comes to full Medicaid expansion, the health and wellness of those same children, and their parents and caregivers, grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. But go on, Greg.
Many of these parents asking for help are your constituents. And I would encourage you to think about them as we vote on this bill today. Mr. President, I'm happy to answer any questions, and if there are none, I would yield the well.
Columnist, reporter, friend of the show, Jay Bookman at the Georgia Recorder, filing this opinion piece at georgiarecorder.com. I'll include it in the show notes. In fact, it dropped at 1 a.m. this morning. He was up late. In its attempt to shove school vouchers down the throat of reluctant voters, Georgia Republicans have argued that the state's existing structure of public school is not capable of providing an adequate education to many students, especially to those in, quote, failing schools. Bookman writes, if that's true, it's basically an admission of failure by the GOP, since that party has dominated Georgia politics. That's what I said from the start of the show, right? And Georgia education policy for more than 2 decades now. But it also creates a problem of a different sort. You see, in the words of the Georgia Constitution, the provision of an adequate public education for the citizens shall be a primary obligation of the state of Georgia. Note the terms primary obligation, Jay writes, and even more importantly, quote, adequate public education, not private, public. That's the duty that the Constitution confers upon those in charge, Bookman writes. By telling us that the state is not providing an adequate public education, Georgia's current political leadership, including Governor Brian Kemp, is telling us that in its own judgment, it is failing to perform its constitutional duties. That puts them in a bit of a pickle. Bookman continues, in Senate Bill 233, the private school voucher program that now stands on the precipice of passage, the General Assembly attempts to hand-wave its way out of that dilemma. The bill states that the creation of a voucher program, a program supposedly justified because our schools are inadequate, quote, shall not be construed to imply that a public school did not provide a free and appropriate public education or constitute a waiver or admission by the state. Well, isn't that convenient? Back to Bookman. So we're supposed to believe that our public school system is simultaneously failing and not failing. Here's what we do know, Bookman writes. We know that schools in lower income areas are usually those most likely to face challenges, and we know that Georgia is one of only 6 states in the country that does not provide additional state funding to school systems serving large numbers of children from low-income families. Let me repeat that. We know that Georgia is one of only 6 states in the country that do not provide additional state funding to school systems serving large numbers of children from low-income families. The General Assembly could fund such a program, but instead is choosing to fund private school vouchers. Bookman writes, under SB 233, it is allocating up to $141 million a year to help students in lower performing schools, air quote, escape into supposedly better performing private schools. Based on years of research, most of those private schools will not be better performing. And by the way, let me just add this. If you live far from a metropolitan area or a large city, the private schools don't even exist in most of rural Georgia. There's a heat map I'll share with you in the show notes that will bear that out. And based on the trajectory, Bookman writes, of voucher programs in other states, that $141 million is a mere down payment on what's to come. Next year, they'll come back for more, and then much, much more. It happens every time in every state. Initially, the Georgia voucher is limited to a maximum of $6,000 plus a $500 transportation subsidy. That $6,000 is nowhere near enough to allow poor families to cover tuition for a quality private school education, which costs 2 to 5 times that much. But it's a nice subsidy for upper middle class families already paying for a private school education, which is how most vouchers will be used. Under the provisions of SB 233, the only students eligible for vouchers are those who live in school districts ranked in the bottom 25% of Georgia school districts. That provision may seem like a good faith attempt to limit vouchers to where they would supposedly do the most good. But again, based on the trajectory of other states, the limitation will be only temporary. It will be eliminated as soon as it is politically feasible to do so. Bookman continues, all across the country, it's the same pattern. What we're witnessing is the gradual, persistent, conscious erosion of the public education system. And once we allow that foundation to crumble, it will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to rebuild. In some states that are further down that road, we're already seeing calls to use public tax money to build the physical infrastructure for private schools, which would then be owned not by the taxpayers who paid for them, but by the non-profit or in some cases for-profit private schools. Can I just tell you, by the way, I'll get back to Bookman in a second. Can I just tell you, by the way, we already see this with our public use of taxpayer dollars to build stadia and arena for for-profit sports franchises. We've got a fight going on between Alpharetta and Forsyth County now to determine who's going to throw the most of their taxpayer dollars at a venue for a new National Hockey League franchise that is going to get to use that facility for pennies on the dollar, what you and I, if we wanted to rent it, would have to pay, so that they, the billionaire owner of the franchise, can come and be the for-profit entity that they are and pay millionaires who play a sport really well to play. Back to Bookman. Here's what's most galling. This campaign to deconstruct our public education system, a system described in our state constitution as a primary obligation of state government, is not driven, not by popular demand. In every state that vouchers have been put on the ballot, they have been thoroughly rejected. Even Georgia Republicans, with an overwhelming advantage in both the House and Senate, can barely scrape together legislative majorities to pass vouchers. Instead, the campaign is being driven by a relative handful of extremely rich, extremely ideological campaign donors around the country. Their message has been clear in every state that has adopted vouchers. If you want their campaign money, you must do their bidding. And Governor Brian Kemp wants their campaign money. Back to the Senate floor, where Senator Elena Parent chimed in after Greg Dolezal.
Thank you. I appreciate the significant narrowing of this legislation that our colleagues in the House did, but it's still a very problematic bill for a couple reasons that I'm going to share with you briefly. Education is complicated and it's expensive. Choosing an institution and a program that fits a child's needs is hard, and I know because I've got 2 school-age children myself. And when you factor in cost, it gets even more difficult. And some families don't have the choices that we would like them to have. The reality is that a $6,500 voucher here doesn't go nearly far enough to afford any quality private education.
Nope.
The state spends more than that on public schools. Tuition for private schools, quality private schools, is well beyond $6,500. If you want to talk about real school choice, and I've said this before, let's talk about it. Put our money where our mouth is. Give every kid $20,000. Give them $25,000. Then we'd actually be talking about real school choice. $6,500 is a shiny object to distract from the failings of this building, of education, Georgia's education system. Can't fix it without hard conversations and real investment. This is a shiny object, in my opinion, to distract from that. And the lack of accountability built in shows is a real tell that it's nothing but a shiny object to distract from the things that we should be doing to improve Georgia's public schools. This is really a choice for private schools. All of you know, I think, that the family actually wouldn't be able to choose. Private schools can and do reject students all the time.
That's right.
And they can do that for any reason that they want. Lack of space, ability to pay, behavioral difficulties, English as a second language, not being able to meet the particular needs that that child and that family may present with. That's a luxury that our public schools do not have, and is one reason that it's incredibly difficult to compare the results of public schools and private schools, because you're just not starting with the same population.
That's right.
The same can be said at times for public charter schools, although I am a supporter of public charter schools. Once a family goes to one of these private schools, how will they know, with taxpayer money, and that's the key thing, with taxpayer money, how will the family know if their child is learning on grade level? What will happen if when a child is thrown from the frying pan of an underperforming public school into the fire of a failing private institution? Without accountability, precious time is lost and much damage can be done.
She makes a valid point. I'm going to give you that entire speech in today's show notes as well at ronshowatl.com. Quick break, back after this on The Ron Show. So we're in the home stretch of The Ron Show. Thank you for listening. I do appreciate you doing that, whether it's on the American One Radio app, AmericanOneRadio.com, on demand at progressivevoices.com, or via podcast. At Ron Show ATL is how you can follow us on your various social media feeds. 404-919-2725. Representative Eric Swalwell bringing the good news to us yesterday.
It's time to pack it up. And I want to give you the top 10 reasons why impeachment is dead. Number 10, your key witness today is testifying from the slammer. Number 9, key evidence of a bribe that you all relied on. The guy who said that has been indicted for lying about that bribe, and he's a Russian asset. Number 8, another key witness has been indicted as a Chinese agent. Number 7, during the Hunter Biden interview, Mr. Chairman, you didn't even stay for the whole time. Number 6, Chairman Jason Smith didn't show up at all to the Hunter Biden interview. The same day, number 5, Darrell Issa said it's a big nothing. Number 4, today Jim Jordan began his remarks not by relying on any evidence for this investigation, but he went off attacking the DOJ about what they're doing with the Catholics. Number 3, you all still have not sent the articles of impeachment for the Mayorkas impeachment to the Senate, and that happened last month. Number 2, you're now talking about a criminal referral, but if you had evidence for a criminal referral, then you have evidence to impeach somebody for high crimes and misdemeanors. And number 1, and I'm sorry to say this, Fox News isn't even carrying this today. In fact, one of their anchors, as they broke away 10 minutes in, said, this is the same hearing over and over and over. At what point are you going to fish or cut bait? So I just have to tell you, it's over. Impeachment's over. Dunzo. Bye-bye. Rigor mortis. Lights out. Curtain drop. Mic drop. Peace. Adios. Sayonara. Au revoir. Or a language that you all understand, Doi Sivdanya. Did I say that right, Mr. Parnas?
Yes.
I dare you to impeach, but you won't because you don't have the evidence. And because you don't have the evidence, you don't have the votes. Guys, it's dead. And so I'm here to pronounce the time of death.
And then he goes on to write the time of death on a big placard, because big placards are the thing now in congressional hearings. Soviet-born, former associate and businessman, friend of Rudy Giuliani, henchman for the Trump campaign, Lev Parnas, giving the damning testimony yesterday.
From shortly after my arrest on October 9, 2019 to now, I have been trying to share the irrefutable truth with you. The American people have been lied to by Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, and various cohorts of individuals in government and media positions. They created falsehoods to serve their own interests, knowing it would undermine the strength of our nation. From November 2018 to October 2019, I was a key participant and a witness to numerous efforts to prove that Joe and Hunter Biden were linked to corruption in Ukraine. Rudy Giuliani, on behalf of then President Donald Trump, tasked me with a mission to travel the globe, finding dirt on the Bidens so that an array of networks could spread misinformation about them, thus securing the 2020 election for Donald J. Trump. Ironically, when I was arrested, my original indictment linked me to an individual referred to as unindicted co-conspirator 1. We now know this individual to be Congressman Pete Sessions, who sits on this very committee today. Today, I ask you to consider the following. In nearly a year traveling the world and interviewing officials in different countries, I found precisely zero evidence of the Biden's corruption in Ukraine. No credible source has ever provided proof of criminal activity, not the FBI, CIA, nor the NSA. No respectable Ukrainian official has ever said that the Bidens did anything illegal, including former President Poroshenko and former Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko. Even when CEO of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky, was offered a deal by Rudy Giuliani in exchange for information on the Bidens, he provided none, because there is none. The only information ever pushed on the Bidens in Ukraine has come from one source, and one source only: Russia and Russian agents. The impeachment proceedings that bring us here now are predicated on false information spread by the Kremlin. Everyone involved knew they were sharing lies. From Trump and Giuliani's shadow diplomacy, through my missions to Ukraine and elsewhere, to members of a BLT team, a group convened for the sole purpose of investigating and damaging the Bidens. Everything was for the ultimate benefit of Donald Trump and thereby Vladimir Putin. Because the team's investigations were centered around Biden and Ukraine, I was designated the point person in every matter they pursued. That is how I know with certainty that these Biden stories are untrue then and are untrue now. Congressman Pete Sessions, then Congressman Devin Nunes, Senator Ron Johnson, and many others understood they were pushing a false narrative. The same goes for John Solomon, Sean Hannity, and media personnel, particularly at Fox News, who used this narrative to manipulate the public ahead of the 2020 elections. Sadly, they are still doing this today as we approach the 2024 elections. We cannot separate this conspiracy from the Russian-Ukraine war because Trump has no intention to keep aiding Ukraine. Without the support of the United States and NATO, millions in Ukraine will suffer and die. If we allow Russia to defeat Ukraine, eventually that suffering will reach American shores. Today, I admit my own wrongdoings. I have been a convicted federal election campaign and fraud crimes and served my sentence. I do not hide that from reality. It is part of my truth. Despite rigorous attempts by those in power to silence me, I will be silenced no longer. Thank you to the committee for allowing me to speak. I look forward to answering any and all of your questions.
The believable when he worked for Trump, but not believable because he's testifying against him, Lev Parnas. That's it for The Ron Show. Show notes at ronshowatl.com. Back tomorrow at 9 to 10 a.m. on America One Radio. Have a good one.